Welcome to our second session that is of peace and non-killing in world's religions. So, in today's session, I will basically be briefing as to why religion is important for non-killing philosophy. Why are we introducing religious studies in the domain of non-killing? As far as history goes, there have been wars, there have been crusade wars that were specifically fought in the name of religion. So, whether it is the religion of Christianity, whether it is the religion of Islam, Hinduism, or Sikhism, there have been various wars fought in the entire human history, wherein we have seen mass bloodshed, all occurring in name of religion. All the religious leaders have cited that their religious scriptures say that if a particular ideology is not followed or if some specific god is not worshipped, that's what I have heard about with special reference to Islamic religion and also in Christian religion. So then we are given the chance we are given the word by God Himself that we should be waging war against such persons who do not follow this particular concept. In current times also, we have seen a lot many times terrorist activities taking place, and the reason always cited is religious, that there is some religious ideology behind it. So the question now arises in the mind of many people is, does that religion scripture actually says to kill? And if it does, are we supposed to follow that book which was written 1400 years back, some thousand years of back, and are we not to modernize ourselves or civilize ourselves with the changing times? So if something has been written in a book, is it so definite that we cannot change it even if it disturbs the most basic principles of humanity? So there are a lot of questions which I believe Dr. Thomas can cover, citing and explaining us that are these religious ideologies actually behind these killings? Are they sanctioning these killings, or the leaders of today are misinterpreting these religious scriptures and using it for their advantage to wage the war? So over to you, Thomas. With this, I would like to hand over the platform to you to enlighten us about the religious scriptures of the various religions we are going to cover. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Dr. Kacheni Singh. And you raised some very important issues in your introduction, which I don't think we're going to, cover them all in this session. We have 4 sessions left in this course. And today I'm going to be focusing on the earliest religions in history, because having gone into this matter in great detail, I am of the view that we have to start by looking at what are called the primal religions. We need to understand what religion is before we can talk intelligently about it. And it's a Latin word meaning that which connects, that which binds society, religio. In Sanskrit, it might be better defined as yoga, which is what joins the soul to God, from a root yuj, meaning to join or connect. So there's something deep in human nature that seeks this unity of the individual soul with the divine. And all the evidence from historians, anthropologists, and people that have studied the matter show that every single tribe in history has always had some kind of religion. Let's just use that term because it's the technical term, but bear in mind it would need really defining as an interior process, but also as a sociological process. There's the internal journey of the soul, and then there's the group worship, going to the temple, the mosque, or whatever. Now, do these teachings sanction violence, war, killing, or not? Okay, it's a very complicated question. I'm going to start by looking at primal religions generally. And if you use my periodic table of the religions, which is the first ever attempt to chart them all scientifically, you'll see there the green ones at the top of the table, right? And every university should have a copy of this in poster form on its humanities department wall. I hope the Center for Non-Killing Studies, will send you a copy of the poster, right? So these are all the primal religions of humanity, starting with primal shamanism, African religions, ancient Celtic religions, and so on. These are the ones I'm talking about first. And they're like oxygen and hydrogen is in the chemical elements. They're primal. That's why they're called primal religions. What's their characteristic? Well, they all started out as oral teachings. So they don't actually have texts because they date from about 100,000 years ago, the very first human beings on this planet. When those rock shelters were being painted by artists about 30,000 years ago near Bhopal, this was their religion. They were primal people. They worshipped nature. They worshipped the forces of nature, the earth, the sun, the moon, and fire. Our ancestors invented fire, discovered fire about 100,000 years ago. Some people say 200,000, but minimally 100,000. And speech also developed around that time. When fire develops, speech comes. So, because you can sit up around the fire and you can share stories and myths, and you can invent ways of describing your day and also your feelings. Families would sit up around the fire at night, the children go to bed. It's not that dissimilar to what we do now. And they would have told stories, myths, and so on. Their worldview was peopled by the animal kingdom. So these shamans believed the animals were kind of deities. You had to mimic the animal. So become the eagle, become the bird, become the lion, become the tiger. And these traces have been found in all religions of that primal shamanic phase. It's not correct to call it animal worship. No, they're worshipping spirit, but they're worshipping that in the form of animals, right? Now, they also, obviously, we know that these primal peoples occasionally came into conflict with each other. They had tools, they had stone axes and so on. But I think killing was quite a small part of their lifestyle. They didn't get set out to kill within their own band because they were small in number. And therefore, they were more interested in killing their prey to survive, certainly not each other. And then other bands, they would respectfully, agree to disagree, and one would have one valley and the other valley. Probably sometimes there were little mini wars going on among these primal peoples, as there are to this day in places like New Guinea, and where these primal peoples are still dominant in the last 200 years. Anthropologists have studied their war patterns. But like I said last time, they're mostly symbolic wars. They don't want to kill, they want to just shame or humiliate the enemy and make them accept their dominance. So it's more like animals asserting dominance in the jungle. Like the tiger wants to prove that he's the king, or the lion. And so the other animals just accept that. Okay, so that's the first primal religions, which are really important. Now they did have religious specialists called shamans, and that's a word that every culture had something like that, whose job was to contact the other world, the world of spirit, who somehow had techniques to contact the great beings that govern human affairs. We could call them the gods. And if you were sick or ill, or you were going crazy, or you were depressed or whatever, you would go to the shaman and they would contact the gods and give you a recipe, a medicine, a prayer, a song, a dance, whatever, to restore you back to health. And for thousands of years, that grew into what we call religion. let's move now and look at one of the traditions that evolved out of that primal tradition is what we now today call Hinduism in India. I'm going to start with that since we're running this course in India. Hinduism is known to have evolved out of those early primal religious um, functions. And so some of the tribal people in India, they're still at that shamanic primal phase. But later, obviously, with the invention of writing and urbanization and the first cities and towns come into being and temples get built and statues and so on are made of the gods. So that spirituality becomes more codified and it gets written down. So there we have the Vedas. So the Rig Veda, one of the probably the earliest Vedas, is still from that primal time. They're worshipping the elements. Agni, the element of fire, is prominent in the Vedas. Indra, the god of justice and the heavens, is very prominent with his thunderbolts. And so Hinduism begins out of that primal tradition. Does it accept violence and war? Well, even the gods themselves are engaged in war because there are demonic forces that the gods have to battle with. Indra is a warrior king of the gods, and he has to defeat the demonic forces, and he uses his thunderbolts to do that. And other gods, they're not all pacifists, as it were. So it emerges in that time when human society did have conflict. However, Hinduism preserves something really, really important, which is the ideal of non-killing. Because in yoga, and that emerged from out of the bedrock of primal traditions, there is this concept that in order to find truth, in order to find the absolute truth behind all the gods, Brahman, the absolute, the creator, you have to adopt a lifestyle of non-violence, ahimsa. You can't become a student of a great yogi in Indian philosophy unless you accept ahimsa. It's the entrance card to the course. And that comes with also not telling lies, which is a form of violence, not stealing, which is another form of violence. So it's about subtle violence as well as overt violence. You can't hit the guru. If you hit the guru, you're off the course. So yoga develops in early Hinduism, pretty early. We have the Upanishads, which are about 800 BC onwards. These are really profound philosophical texts, and non-violence is at the heart of them. There's a realization, therefore, that by these ancient people that non-killing leads to greater wisdom than killing, even though killing can be necessary tragically sometimes in small doses. The real goal for humanity is non-killing. And then developed particular techniques. So we have Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and all the other great scriptures that teach meditation, that teach how to focus the mind away from demonic forces, because most of us live with, anxiety, emotional anxiety, shock, fear, and all that stuff. Well, to the Indian mind, these are like demonic forces that we have to conquer. And the only way to do that is with meditation, with centering the mind in truth. Tantra develops around that time, again, an oral tradition, it wasn't written down, with ways to do that. How do we reach transcendence? How do we reach a place of peace? That's what Hinduism, I think, at its best offered. And it still does to this day. There is the tradition in India. You see, yes, there were warriors, the Kshatriya class. They are fearsome warriors in the Indian tradition. And they developed texts like the Bhagavad Gita that sort of seem to justify killing, because Arjuna is told by Krishna he has to fight. He can't duck out of it. And all the other great warriors, Drona and all the rest, they all go to battle. But Krishna himself doesn't. And there's a realization that the true yogi, the true seer, never actually fights. And so the Brahmin class evolved in Indian society and philosophy as one that esteems non-killing. A Brahmin today is not supposed to be in the army, not supposed to fight. You won't find any gurus, or you shouldn't, up in Rishikesh or whatever, who are secretly in the army. I mean, they're not supposed to. They're supposed to be totally non-violent, and I hope that that is still the case. And certainly the ones I've met, they've all taught ahimsa. Okay, so that's Hinduism, and it's an ideal form, and then it's the reality of the practice. Now I want to shift and look at African religions, because anthropologists say that our first ancestors developed in Africa. It's a huge continent, it's vast, and many different tribes over the centuries, the millennia, in fact, they found early hominid traces there. So what about African religion? It's very similar to Indian. African peoples have fought. We know historically they were warriors. Each tribe has a sort of fierce martial tradition. And yet they also esteem peace. So the most sophisticated religion to have emerged out of Africa is the ancient Egyptian religion along the Nile Valley, which is like 1,000 miles long, longest river in the world after the Amazon. And they developed writing very, very early, before the Indians even, one of the first in the world. And the hieroglyphs were translated thanks to Napoleon going to Egypt in 1800, and a man called Champollion was able to translate it into French and British. And so the Egyptian religion is fascinating. And peace was absolutely stressed. The chief god's job is to defeat the forces of chaos, evil, and to ensure the harmony and order of society. So the chief goddess, Ma'at, was the bringer of order, or what we would call Dharma in Sanskrit. So the Egyptian religion believed in Ma'at is the principle of truth and honor with each other, with our families and so on. And because they believe strongly in the afterlife, the Egyptians knew that when you die, your soul doesn't die, it goes on in consciousness, which is something that near-death experience research now confirms scientifically, I think. I don't think there's any doubt that the soul survives death now. The Egyptians knew this 5,000 years ago, and their whole teaching, therefore, was that you have to live a pure life, so that when you die and your soul is judged by the council of elders, you have to read out a whole list of things. I haven't lied, I haven't cheated, I haven't killed, is one of the things you have to be able to say to get into the afterlife. If you've murdered, then you're not allowed in. You go to another place, which is a place of judgment, punishment, a sort of hell world where you burn off your sins. And so the Egyptians are really strict on this. So Ma'at guarantees that. The other great god who's involved is Osiris, who is the lord of the underworld. So if you're a pious Egyptian, when you die, you're going to meet Osiris and Ma'at. They will judge you. And if you've murdered, if you've been a thief and killed people, you will be punished. That. So the Egyptians absolutely firmly believe that. And well, what about so what happened to that? Where's that Egyptian knowledge gone? Okay, it was associated after the Greeks invaded Egypt. They conquered it sort of peacefully, really, under Alexander the Great, who also came to India. He wanted to unite the world all the way from Africa to India in one great peaceful empire. Unfortunately, he died too early, didn't quite pull it off. But in Egypt, he founded a city called Alexandria, which had the biggest library in the world. They translated these ancient Egyptian texts into Greek, and these are called the Hermetica, the Hermetic writings. Hermes was the Greek name for their other chief god, who's called Thoth. The other great god of Egypt is Thoth, or Hermes, and he was the god of scribes and universities. So what we're doing, teaching, studying, is Thoth's work. And again, he taught these Hermetic scriptures. If you've not read them, really, you must. They're like the Bible of ancient Egypt. And it's incredible they've come down to us. We still have these texts. They tell why the universe was created, who created it, what for, why humans were created, and why we're here in bodies. They talk about what happens when you die, what is the essence of ethics. Now, these texts were lost to history. They were vanished until they were retranslated into Latin in about 1390, 1400 in Florence. And this is called the Hermetic Renaissance, which gave birth to the Renaissance in European thought. It was a huge, had a huge impact because here were ancient Egyptian texts, which seemed to be very, very wise indeed. Okay, so what about Africa today? Many Africans are still pagans. They would still look back on their primal roots and be proud of their African traditions. But why is Africa so full of war and conflict? You know, where's the peace teaching? Where's the non-killing? Because Africa's had huge amounts of civil wars and conflicts, and some of them are still going on. Look at Ethiopia at the moment. It's a country in crisis with killing going on. Well, you know, that is true and it's tragic, but and we shouldn't forget the tragic role of slavery in deforming Africa's culture, because the Islamic and Christian slave trade operated and saw Africans as sort of beasts of burden. I think that's changing. And we shouldn't forget that Nelson Mandela was an African believing in his own tradition, and he advocated nonviolence, ahimsa. He was influenced by Gandhi, who developed his teachings in Africa, in South Africa. And there are many now African intellectuals teaching peace. There are centers for peace studies throughout the continent. So I think there's hope that the non-killing paradigm can flourish in Africa, based partly on their own religious teachings. Okay, I want to talk next briefly about Chinese religions, because they're also extremely interesting. And this is obviously a whistle-stop tour, sadly. We can go into more detail, you know, if there's time in questions and discussion. China's a huge country all to itself, obviously, and an ancient civilization, which was closed off from the rest of the world. But it's contributed enormously to the world in ways that most people don't realize. Things like the invention of paper, which for us scholars is pretty important. You know, we can't survive without paper. Well, the Chinese invented it, and is invented by a little Taoist priest. And if you've read Joseph Needham's great book on science and civilization in China, it's about 12 volumes, Cambridge University Press. He was an expert in Chinese civilization culture. So China was quite a violent civilization. We know that it had kings or emperors who had chariots, who had warfighting equipment, and they often liked to be buried with their slaves. It was quite a hierarchical society. So the emperor would be buried with 1,000 people that he would have killed, men and women, on a very primitive concept that they would then be able to serve him in the afterlife. So there is that primal, which the Marxists today look back on as ancient feudalism. They're embarrassed by it. They say those are the times of darkness, you know. And so, but there was a resistance to this kind of state-centered violence. China developed this idea of the emperor's will is absolute, you can't resist it, and he has the right to kill you. There was a time in Chinese history called the time of warring states, around about the 400s BC, when China was divided into about 6 different states, each of which had its own army. And they were all fighting each other perpetually for about 200 years, quite fiercely. And it was during that time that Confucius came to live. Now, Confucius was a realist. He was a sage in the ancient Chinese tradition. And he accepted that, yes, you know, kings have to fight. There have to be armies. But he wanted to put rules to it. Mass killing, no, that's totally out. Unjustified aggression, no, that's totally out. That's not ethical. What Confucius tried to do was put ethical rules on killing and limit it. Now, at the same time, Confucius respected the gods, but he said it wasn't his business to really know about them. they're a mystery. He said it's important to do the rituals, go to the temples, say the prayers. You can't fathom the consciousness of the gods. None of us can. And in his Analects, these wise sayings that have come down, I mean, he's a very, very profound philosopher who knew the limitations of human thought, like Kant did later on, similar. And so Confucius respected the work of his slightly older compatriot, a man called Lao Tzu, who seems to have been an archivist in one of the warring kingdoms, right? Confucius was always traveling about with his band of disciples. Maybe 100 people would go with him. And he went from different kingdom to different kingdom, teaching his ethics. But Lao Tzu was an archivist in one of the kingdoms. They probably actually met, although scholars still debate this. Lao Tzu was much more mystical. He was, let's say, more religious. And he wrote his book, the Tao Te Ching, the way, and it's how to cultivate the way, how to find the Tao, which is a very complex Chinese word meaning the way, but it's also the process or the flow that makes life possible. Within all of us, there's a flowingness. Modern psychologists talk about flow with a capital F. Well, that's the Tao. So God to the Chinese mind is not a person with a name, but rather like a river with a current running through it. And our duty as human beings is to stay in contact with that current. And that's what we call Taoism. That became the religion of China. And many, many great temples, sages, saints have developed. I mean, I have an encyclopedia of Taoism that's 1,000 pages long, full of mystics and wonder workers. They were all advocates of non-killing. The Taoist tradition is China's pacifism. It's the equivalent of the Hermetic traditions in Egypt or the Upanishads in India. The Taoists believe that the sage should never have to kill because, like you, as educators, we should be trying to educate a person out of their anger or their rage or their disturbance. Whatever it is that makes somebody want to kill a human being, they have to be pretty ill. And the sage's job is to heal them and not let it get to that extreme. So by melding with the void, and these Taoist scriptures are very detailed. There are practices like yoga to do with breathing, diet, the way that we should treat each other, all kinds of esoteric practices were still passed down in Taoism to this day. And of course, they mostly flourish in Taiwan, which has religious freedom. There are some sacred Taoist centers in mainland China, but not so many. So this is where I think we look for the non-killing paradigm in Chinese civilization, and it's very profound. And again, their idea was summarized as what we could call alchemy, which is a discussion of how you transform the lead of normal basic human consciousness into gold or enlightenment. Taoism teaches a path to enlightenment, which is very similar to that of India's ancient tantric and Upanishadic traditions. The point is to reach moksha or enlightenment, at which point killing, just doesn't arise. You're trying to kill your own negativity, your own fears, your own ego, essentially. So, yeah, that's the Chinese contribution to a culture of non-killing, which is precious. Okay, at this point, I think I'm going to hand back to you, Dr. Singh. Any points or comments you want to make? I've done a whistle-stop tour through 4 of our traditions, and I hope you found it useful.
Yes, indeed, it was very useful, but I do have some doubts of my own also, based on what you have told. You started with the primal religions, that there are certain primal religions like Hinduism, the African religion, the Egyptian, and then Chinese Taoism, if I'm correct. So, yeah. So when we are talking about worshipping of nature, is it a negative aspect of a civilization? Do you review it as a negative aspect of a civilization or a positive aspect? Because with reference to, as for my interpretation about worshipping of nature goes, I think it was basically done to show that nature is important to us. We cannot survive if the nature is not pure, and that we can see right now owing to all the environmental hazard that is happening around us. So if that is the case, because initially there have been a lot of defamations against all the religions who worshipped nature, calling them as uncivilized or not progressive religions because they were worshipping elements of nature which are dead, which are innate. So yeah, so there have been these things. And then second point, you talked about Alexander, that how he wanted to integrate the whole world into one, and so he came up till India, invaded till India. So basically, when we're talking about integration, there are two ways by which you can integrate. One is by means of coercion, force. That is what Alexander used, war, military, and the other means is called as peaceful integration. That is with the consent of the common people or with the approval of the other person. You merge your identity with the other person. So the problem I think that was there with Alexander was that he was too brutal. He killed lot of people in his process of integration. So again, from Nonkilling perspective, we do not view him as a great warrior, because a great warrior should be a one who should have a peaceful approach and not do bloodshed. Should not be indulging in bloodshed activities. And yeah, and rightly you pointed out that Nelson Mandela was a peaceful leader who was advocating for non-violence and non-killing also. But I just wanted to bring this into light that initially Nelson Mandela was not a complete believer of non-violence. He wanted to use this as a tool to get the freedom which he wanted to attain for the blacks in Africa. And he said, if that can be used as a tool, I'm ready to use it. But he never, initially, he did not say no to violence. It was, I think, later on when there were a lot of violent activities in the African state, by the state as well as by his party, that then he strictly switched his side to non-violence. And I think that was the reason that along with him, there was one more person, I'm forgetting the white president name. Both of them were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize together because they had strictly adhered to this principle of non-violence. So these were just few observations which from your commentary I could gather, and I just wanted to have a dialogue on this.
Sure. Sure. No, those are all very important points. Your first point you make about these cultures also have negative traits to them. I mean, yes, of course, I didn't go into that in detail, but it looks like every single tribe known to anthropologists and even, tribal traditions practice some kind of human sacrifice at some point in its career. And when, in a minute, I'm going to talk about the American Indian culture, yeah, every single tribe in the American Indian culture practiced human sacrifice, sometimes on a huge scale. We know that in ancient China, they did effectively, this is human sacrifice, killing your servants to take to the afterlife. That's human sacrifice. And So that's ritual killing of other human beings was practiced on quite a large scale. Why? What is this idea? So that's something that would make a whole, I mean, there have been books written about this. But fortunately, as we're going to see when we do next time, we're going to be talking about the monotheistic religions. The great revolution the monotheistic religions brought was to abolish human sacrifice. And we'll learn how that was done and what the implication of that was next session. But that was a huge leap forward to non-killing, and that was a monotheistic progress. Although, obviously, in the Taoist tradition, they also said no human sacrifice. They sublimated it to the alchemical goal of enlightenment. In advanced Hinduism, you don't do human sacrifice. You practice yoga and so on. It was just a few thuggy sects that still used to do human sacrifice. When the British came to India, it was actually the British that actually outlawed that. There were still people thinking it was okay to be sacrificed to Kali or whatever. And sati is a form of human sacrifice where the widow burns herself or is burned on the pyre of the husband. I mean, that's a kind of human sacrifice. So all this was abolished by the monotheistic British, who thought that was progress. But yeah, in Africa too, the tribes did practice human sacrifice. But these things are taking a long time to grow out of. The question about worshipping nature that you raised is an important one. I think myself, I'm both a pagan and a monotheist simultaneously. I think we can learn from both. What we can learn from the pagan primal religions is a reverence for nature and a sense of awe and piety at its incredible complexity. Modern physicists, chemists, the more they look at, say, plants, the more incredible they are. Plants seem to be conscious. They can tell when somebody comes into the room who means to do them harm. Trees seem to be conscious in ways that modern science still can't figure out. So we should be respectful to trees and plants, just as the primal peoples of the ancient world were. Their medicines come from plants. So plant medicine is something to be really profoundly respectful of. They also used medicines from plants for psychedelic effects. They had soma or whatever, compounds in all these primal religions. They would induce religious experiences through knowing which psychoactive plants to take, be it mushrooms or other types of things. And this then induced a kind of soul journey for the individual that it breaks down the ego. So you can't come away from it like wanting to kill other people because you've just died and been reborn. The psychedelic experience is one of profound disintegration of the ego into the divine. And then you come back as Kacheni or Thomas or whoever, and you're much more humble. And we know this has been going on in these primal religions since the beginning of time. There's one thinker who argued that's how human consciousness developed. That's the beginning of humanization. Why did our ancestors suddenly become able to speak? Well, it was because they explored the boundaries of consciousness. That's one theory, which is getting traction among anthropologists of consciousness. So yeah, there's negative stuff, but I choose to look at the positive stuff because I believe if we go down the black hole of looking at the negative stuff, the world really is can end up with demonic despair and self-destruction. I think if we can try and find the positive thing from human evolution, there have always been voices against violence in each culture, and I think we should celebrate them, find them, and try and strengthen the scholarship around these things. I mean, we could talk, I didn't go into this, but we could talk about what happened to Chinese civilization. If it's so loving and warm and cuddly and Taoist, how come under the Mao Zedong it led to mass slaughter when the Chinese invaded Tibet? They weren't adopting a non-killing paradigm; they were massacring monks. And I've got a terrible book about Tibet called Tibet, O Tibet, which reveals they actually were practicing ritual cannibalism on the Tibetans as a strategic policy. The Maoist armies invaded a country in Tibet, and they would take over a region, and they would call together the head man of the village or the town, and they would ritually kill him, cook him, and eat him in front of the people to say, look, we're the Chinese, we're in charge here. There's nothing you can do to stop us. And this has been documented and proved in certain regions of Western Tibet. Ritual cannibalist killing was done by the Maoist armies to frighten and shock the Tibetans so much they would lay down their weapons. And of course they did. They were terrified. So hang on, that's going on in the 20th century, like by supposedly scientific people who are supposed to have read Karl Marx and believe in communism and utopia, you know. In fact, Mao never read Karl Marx. This is another secret I'd like to share with you. I've just finished reading a biography of Stalin, very interesting. And he invited Mao to Russia for talks about giving China nuclear weapons. And Mao was there in a villa outside Moscow for like 2 months, and they bugged the villa. So Russian intelligence put little microphones everywhere, which Mao didn't realize. So everything he said was picked up by Russian intelligence. And Molotov went to negotiate, you know, how many nuclear weapons do you need, Stalin, Mao? And, you know, they were discussing like that. And Molotov asked him about Marxism. He said, like, what do you really think about communism? What did you think of Das Kapital? And Mao said, and it was caught on the listening devices, oh, I don't believe in all that stuff. I've never read Marx. I just adopted it as a slogan to become a bandit chieftain. I've never read Marx. Are you kidding? It's impossible. Now you know, that's where we are. So Mao was a fraudster, actually. And thankfully, the Chinese realized this, but he was an evil and dangerous and very violent fraudster who believed killing was acceptable. The other thing that was picked up in that phone conversation they listened to, when Mao was given nuclear weapons by Stalin, Stalin said, look, Mao, I'll give you a few, but you promise you're not going to use them, are you? Because that would be terrible. That would kill millions of people. And Mao said to Stalin, after he'd got the bomb, he got it. He said, oh, look, Stalin, you worry about killing people. No. There's so many of us Chinese that I'm very happy to have a nuclear war with America. We can kill all them and we'll still have millions of people still left alive. So I don't have your scruples about killing people. No, that's why I want the bomb. And apparently Stalin was so frightened by this, he couldn't believe, like Stalin was a monster and a mass killer, but he wasn't that bad. He never went to nuclear war, right? Whereas Mao was saying he was happy to. And he was so shocked and frightened that it led to Stalin having a kind of stroke and dying. According to the research I've read, that's why Stalin died. He was terrified by Mao saying he was prepared to kill millions and millions of people because he knew that China would win because they had such a vast population. So, like, hang on, like, so Mao had not read his Taoist handbooks, obviously. He was a monster who actually rejected religion. As a young man, Mao said, I don't believe in anything. I don't believe in my mother's Buddhism. I won't accept ethics. I believe in anti-ethics, and I want to destroy. So that's what we're up against with the corruption of Mao, you know. Anyway, okay, so that's sorry, that was my comment on your comments. Do you want to make any other comment on what I was saying? And I'll go on to the second half. Yeah.
I think I read a similar biography with the similar type of comment by Mao, because even the Indian Prime Minister went to meet Mao, and one of his personal, I think he was personal doctor, personal physician of Mao, He wrote a book, The Private Life of the Chairman. In that, there is a mention that Jawaharlal Nehru asks Mao about avoiding war. And he gives a reply that I am not scared of war because I have got plenty of people. I can afford to lose them.
Yeah.
It was a similar statement.
Yeah, no, it's
And
shocking. I mean, like, are there any centers for non-killing in China at the moment? Can we set up a center in Beijing, maybe?
non-killing, I don't think so. And
It would be
I
good. We should. We should reach
which
out to a Chinese university and ask them to focus on non-killing and the Taoist legacy of Chinese intellectual life. I mean, there are amazing philosophers in China. I know some.
Confucius,
Um,
Sun
they
Tzu.
held the World Congress of Philosophy in Beijing last time. I think it was
Okay.
2018. And one of my friends, a Russian philosopher, went along to that, and others. So, you know, there are profound philosophers in China that would probably want to support the idea of a non-killing paradigm. The days of Mao are gone, you know, thank God. Yeah,
Yes, hopefully.
yeah. Okay, so look, can I go on to the second half?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so this is also going to be exciting. So I'm going to first off start talking about American Indian religions, which is something that I've studied for years. I was born in Canada, as you may know, so I regard myself as kind of North American in my soul to some extent. And I've always loved American Indians. When I was growing up as a boy, you know, you'd see the American Indians fighting the cowboys in the movies. I always thought the American Indians were more romantic and and had much more of a nice kind of attitude to life. So as I've studied American Indian religion in depth, and I've written about it, each tribe had a slightly different worldview. The tribes of the Plains Indians up in the north of the American continent, they worship the buffalo, the white buffalo calf woman, who was their goddess, who brought them tobacco, which they used as a sacred ritual for pacifying the people, actually. Tobacco is an amazing thing the American Indians use for peacemaking. They call it the peace pipe. And I've done ceremonies with American Indians where you pass the pipe around, you take a puff, and you say a prayer. The whole way that tobacco came to the American Indians was to bring prayer. And it's a ritual, a ceremony. So people that smoke, they often don't realize it's actually a sacrament that the American Indians are given to the world and should be used wisely, just in small doses, like prayer. And in the South, obviously, Central America, there were many more cultures. The Aztecs were pretty ferocious, and they did human sacrifice on a major industrial scale. They had a very weird cosmology. They thought that the sun would go out unless it was fed hearts. So the Aztec priest would sacrifice the victim, cut open the chest, pull out the heart, and hold it up to the sun. And then the sun would look on it and think, "Thank you very much. Another one, please." And so they literally seemed to think that the sun depended on being fed these human hearts. And they would sacrifice 200,000 victims a year. Most of them were victims caught in battle. They were the enemy's hearts. That was fine. But if they ran out of the enemy's hearts, they would take the hearts of poor people. And this is obviously, you know, shocking to anyone that's into a non-killing paradigm, but it was practiced. And we can try and understand it, explain it, to do with urbanization, with, I suppose, brainwashing and fear. If you're living in a culture that literally believes the sun wants human sacrifice, then the whole society would reinforce that concept. And this is why when the Roman Catholic Spaniards turned up, and they learned all this, and they saw what was going on, they didn't like human sacrifice on this industrial scale. And they introduced monotheism, the idea that there should be no human sacrifice. and we'll look at that next time. But and that was, I think, a reform that was needed. What about other peace voices? I mean, we know that there were Aztec poets, there were intellectuals. Some of them may have spoken up against all this. There may have been Gandhis who said, "Stop doing mass human sacrifice; it's wrong." But we don't have many of their works because, sadly, a lot of the literature, the libraries of the Aztecs were all burned by the Spaniards. They were so disgusted at this, what they saw, that they just put the whole lot to the bonfire. Some of it was rescued by, Catholic priests and monks who realized that, scholarship needed to look at what they were doing. So we do know some things. There are some books that have come down. The same was going on in the Mayan culture in Mexico, but much less killing. It seems to be much more a society living in harmony with nature, and particularly with time. They perfected the calendar in the Mayan culture, and they had a very, very cosmic, huge view of time, which still, very intriguing to people. And then in the Incan culture of the Andes, again, a sophisticated religion, they worship the sun god called Inti. And we know a bit more about the Incans because some of their top aristocrats learned Spanish after the conquest, and they wrote down their customs and beliefs. And so, they were quite profound people, the Incans. Who among them was speaking for peace? Well, the Incans wanted peace. It was their religious duty to ensure that peace was prevailing in the world. Again, the sun god required not sacrifice, but our happiness, actually. And so they built great temples. They worshipped the gods with gold, but not in the way that the conquistadors did. They saw gold as the sun taking form on earth. So gold was sacred because it was the sun's body. And they felt that when sunlight hits the earth, it makes gold. So they would have one of their temples in Cuzco, I think, in Peru, was covered, the interior walls covered with gold as a sacred thing. And of course, the Spanish didn't get the point. They just took all the gold and shipped it back to Spain and didn't get the god force. Anyway, there's lots to learn here. From the perspective of peacemaking, I want to talk about two American Indian religious leaders who are very important. The first one is called Deganawida, who's often not studied or heard about. He lived up in my part of the world, Canada, and the Great Lakes region, near Toronto, that sort of north shore of the Great Lakes. He was also around in the upper state of New York because, there was no Canada and America, there was just the Indian culture. Now, he had this vision. Deganawida lived about 1300 AD, so before the white contact. And he was a spiritual man, a medicine man. He believed he was contacted by Great Spirit, which is their name for God, and given a mission as a peacemaker. And he's called the peacemaker. So what Deganawida did was he went to all the tribes in his region, and he persuaded their councils and their chiefs to join and make a federation so that no one would go to war with each other, because prior to him, these cultures were always fighting each other in religious bands. Deganawida said, no, this is against Great Spirit. He wants us all to plant a single peace tree, as he called it. And if there's any problems, we will come together in a federal council and discuss it. And he put in place certain teachings which have endured to this day. They're still there in the popular consciousness of the descendants. And I've spoken to Canadian Indians, American Indians, who keep alive his memory. Why he's important, Deganawida, is he tried to replace killing with with, let's call it, political structures of peacemaking. And he inspired the work of the American revolutionaries, William Penn, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. They all studied Deganiwida's work. They knew about it. And they adopted some of the principles into the American Constitution. The idea that discussion is better than war fighting. And then it also inspired the founding of the United Nations, which is in New York, obviously the headquarters. And Deganiwida's inspiration for a federal solution to conflict inspired the founding of the UN as well. So an influential and important thinker who had to go through his spiritual journey. We know that he was opposed by one warrior chieftain who tried to kill him on several occasions, who thought that non-killing and peace was for sissies, and that any good Indian warrior should be allowed to kill anyone he wants. So actually, Deganawida was killed nearly several times. But in fact, he then managed to persuade that guy of his teachings, of the genuineness of his mission as essentially a prophet or a seer. And he became one of his closest followers. And a poem was written by an American poet, Longfellow, about it, called Hiawatha, which tells the story of Deganawida and Hiawatha. This is profound stuff, but a lot of people outside of that area have never heard of him. But I think he stands on a par with Moses or Abraham or Muhammad for the American Indian people. Then we come to another great peace leader in the Americas, a man called Sequoyah, who was from the Cherokee tribes, which are further south, in the south of the American USA. The Cherokees had a really tough time as a tribe. They originally lived over in the Carolinas, which is on the east coast, sort of North Carolina. They had hunting grounds. But as the whites invaded and started pushing, obviously their territory got less and less. And then after about 1820, I think it was, a particular American president decided to exile all the American Indian tribes west of the Mississippi. He passed a law that they had to leave their homes, right? And these Cherokee tribes are rounded up, put on carts, wagons. They could only have what they could carry. Their entire houses were lost because the whites wanted the land. And they had a few blankets. They were given a few blankets, and they were forced to march about 1,000 miles in the winter. And a lot of them died on the way. It's called the Trail of Tears. Again, most people don't know this history. I went and I was invited to go and talk in a Cherokee-inspired place, and I studied all this. I met them, and they still remember this Trail of Tears. And it was a betrayal, a terrible thing. But they couldn't fight back because the whites had bigger weapons, machine guns, kind of Colt revolvers, all the kind of stuff. They didn't have machine guns yet, but they had pretty fearsome weapons. And the Cherokees weren't able to fight them back, so they had to go on this Trail of Tears. They reached the other end of it, a place called Tahlequah, which is where I went and taught. And then a little while later, their chief was born, called Sequoyah. And some of the American Indians were saying we should fight back. We should do guerrilla warfare against these whites. Their word is not to be trusted. They're evil. Let's burn their homes. Let's tomahawk them. And Sequoyah, who was a learned man, who had learned to read English, he'd actually read the Bible, and he'd thought deeply about his own religion of the American Indian Cherokees, which was very, very sophisticated, very sophisticated. He said, no, my friends, we won't use violence to fight these white people. They are crazy, they're greedy, they're small-minded, they don't keep their word. But we will keep our word, and we will make a deal with Great Spirit. They believe this Christ came to help all mankind. So he came to help us too. He's sent from Great Spirit. And we will use the nonviolence that he taught against these white people. We will show them by example what they ought to be doing. So Sequoyah wrote an alphabet for the Cherokee Nation. He was the first one to do this. So they could become learned. The Bible was translated into Cherokee. He said, the best bits of the Bible, the best bits of our native religion, they're at one. You know, we're not crazy people that want killing. We've always respected peace, and so let us do that now. It's the whites that have been wrong. They've pushed us out of our home, but we will win in the end because Great Spirit is on our side, on the side of truth and justice. So he was an amazing man. I went to a museum where his house is now. There's a museum of the American Indian people in Oklahoma. And I went and saw his hut, which is made like a log cabin. He was very simple. He didn't have lots of money, but he was very, very learned. He read both English and then he invented this alphabet. And he set up schools. He said the way we will defeat the white man is through education. We will teach our children to follow the ways of our ancestors and to learn the best about the whites. And we will therefore shame them into behaving properly. So he was a big influence as a great thinker. And many white philosophers, intellectuals, they realized that Sequoyah was like, you know, a voice to reckon with. And they named the biggest tree in the Americas after him, the Sequoyah pine, which rises many hundreds of feet, is named after Sequoyah. So that's why most people have heard of his name, but they've never studied his story, which is, you know, deep and profound. So the other person that was influenced by the American Indians was Thoreau. Thoreau was a collector of American Indian artifacts up in Concord and Lexington, where he lived in Boston area. He was part of the New England Transcendentalists. And he was writing a book about American Indian religion when he died. It was never published. Now, Thoreau developed the idea of civil disobedience that inspired Tolstoy and Gandhi. They both read Thoreau. He was a philosopher. But most people don't realize he was inspired by the American Indian culture as well as the Indian culture, because Thoreau had the most important library of Indian texts shipped from London, the Upanishads, the Vedas, all translated newly into English, he had in his bookshelf. So when Thoreau wrote about non-violence and civil disobedience, I mean, he developed this idea of what Gandhi would later call satyagraha, that the sage shouldn't use violence to defeat evil, but they should use civil disobedience. They should make plain they don't agree with something non-violently. He was protesting against slavery. He said, let's not buy from companies that use slaves. Let's not allow slavers to get away with it. Use non-violence. Of course, his voice wasn't listened to, and America had this huge civil war. They went to fight over it. If they'd listened to Thoreau, they could have got rid of slavery non-violently. But, you know, who listens to philosophers? Okay, so that's the American Indian. There's more I can say, and there are many current peace leaders I've met from the American Indian culture that are profound, and I'm working with some of them, you know, in this Wisdom Keepers group that is run from Canada. I want to talk next about the Celtic traditions in Europe, which are very interesting. They're like the kind of European American Indians in a sense. The Celts are a mysterious people that existed in Northern and Central Europe and Britain and Ireland from earlier than the Bronze Age. The megalithic culture of the Stonehenge and Avebury and Karnak and all these other monuments scattered around Northern Europe. Who built them? Well, it was the Celts. The word Celt means a hidden one, a hidden person. Their religion was pretty much like the American Indian religion, or like the Vedic religion. It believed in various gods. It had a pantheon of gods and goddesses, and it loved these gods and goddesses. Again, forces of nature. So there was the god of the sea, Manana Maclear, who is the sea god who organizes everything to do with that. And and yes, you respect Manana MacLear. He lives on a magical island off the west coast of Ireland, where you're lucky if you go to. When you die, the Celts believe that your soul goes into the sea realms, and it meets on a magical island off the far west. And there's a sort of island of the blessed, where a righteous soul will go. The Celts were warriors. They had tribal conflicts. They invented iron use in Europe, and they put iron rims on the wheels of their carts, and so they were quite fearsome warriors, spreading out, using iron, which was a fearsome weapon, right? But they had this notion that although warriorship is a good thing, and their poetry was all about people like Cuchulainn, who was a great warrior leader in Ireland, who fought a huge battle against Maeve. It's the epic of Irish folk poetry, dating back to the same time as the Vedas, so about 1300 BC, the Bronze Age, and the same idea as Troy. But they also had a class of people called Druids, and the word Druid means a seer of truth. Vid is to see or know, Veda. Dru is Dharma, truth. So the Druid was the one that saw truth. And as a class, they were sworn to non-violence, non-killing. They were the judges, the peacemakers, and the teachers of the Celtic tribes. Now, when I discovered this, and this is not taught in most school, classes, when I researched all this, because I've got partly Irish ancestry and I come from Britain, I got very excited because I thought, well, these are the Brahmins of the Celtic people. These were the seers who practiced non-violence. And it's true. When Caesar tragically invaded Gaul, which was here in France, was run by the Celtic Druids, he wrote fairly about them. He said, yes, these Druids are interesting. They would try and stop battles. They would even go between two opposing armies to try and stop the battle from happening. So the Druid was respected enough as a sage, as a priest, and as a magician to actually say when it was okay to fight and when not. And normally, the Druids would always try and resolve a conflict non-violently. Sometimes, if a particular tribe or a chieftain was crazy, like mad, then they would sanction, a just war, but only in very special circumstances. So anyway, I spent a long time researching the question of the Celts and the Druids, and I've just published a 3-volume encyclopedia of Druid studies. It's the first one ever published, and I put into that a lot of discoveries about them that might interest some students. But what interested me is their commitment to non-violence and their realization that non-killing is much wiser than killing. Any old fool can kill, but because the Celts believed in reincarnation, like the American Indians and the Hindus and Indians, you just got to come back and face your karma all over again. So killing doesn't solve anything. You just have to get another life and you have to learn the lessons. The only way out of this cycle of killing is non-killing, which is why it's the first entrance way to the path of yoga or wisdom. So that's the Celts, and obviously I could say a lot more about them. Maybe in discussion we can go into it. I want to talk about the Greeks now, because the Greeks are interesting, and they were the window between European civilization and the Middle East. So Assyria, Sumer, I talked about Egypt before, all those really ancient civilizations brought their wisdom through Greece because that was the entrance port. And the first thing that they brought was the alphabet. So the Phoenicians, who were an ancient pagan culture, invented the alphabet. And they gave it to the Greeks as traders. And the Greeks wrote down their poetry, Homer, Hesiod, and other of these seers from about 1000 BC onwards. Now, the first things they talk about are the great wars, the Trojan Wars. The Greeks were warriors. You rightly grumbled that Alexander wasn't exactly a man of non-violence. No, he was He was a man following the Trojan War image of the hero Achilles, who with his sword tries to bring, justice to the earth. Unfortunately, Alexander didn't listen to his teacher Aristotle enough. But the Greeks had this undercurrent, as well as the official military, let's all read Homer and die kind of thing. They had a mystical undercurrent going on, which was associated with Orpheus. Now, Orpheus was from northern Greece, Thrace, what is now Bulgaria. He was a prophet or a seer who became very important to the Greek religion. And he taught that how you can enter the underworld. The Greeks call the afterlife the underworld. And he himself could navigate his way down into the underworld. We know all about his love affair with Eurydice, his wife. He loved so much, she was captured and taken to the underworld by the king of the underworld, Pluto. And he went down to get her back using music. He was a musician and a philosopher and a sage. We know that Orpheus also traveled in Egypt, where he learned in the temples from the priests. He traveled to Phoenicia, and he was a true philosopher, if you want. In that tradition came Pythagoras, who looked to Orpheus as his hero. Pythagoras was trying to outdo Orpheus, and he founded a mystical brotherhood in southern Italy at Crotona. And he used the word philosophy for the first time. He called his initiates philosophers. And if you want to know more about this sequence of the birth of philosophy, read a book by a Frenchman called Edgar Schure, Schure, called The Great Initiates. And it gives an amazing version of what these seers were doing. Pythagoras believed in reincarnation, as did Orpheus. He taught the soul's journeys are like a spiral over many lifetimes. The point of philosophy is to reach a place of wisdom where you can choose your next rebirth. You're not coming back because of negative karma. You're coming back to heal, to teach. Pythagoras was said, orally he taught. We don't have many, he never wrote a book, but we have sayings that have come down from him. And he was really a teacher from the place of the mysteries. Now, the mysteries were running at this time in Greece. They were the initiatory place where every Greek went at least twice a year, twice a lifetime. Outside of Athens, there's a place called Eleusis. Oh, by the way, Pythagoras taught nonviolence. That was essential to his teachings, obviously. I mean, that should go without saying, but I do want to make that plain, as did Orpheus. So the mysteries were where you went. It was like a ritual revelatory experience. From Athens, you walked in procession in the spring with a few thousand other people if you were going to be initiated to Eleusis, which is 15 miles out of Athens. I've been there. It's now an archaeological ruin, but in those days it was a huge temple. And you went to wash in the sea, you did all kinds of things. You had to abstain from sex and meat and all kinds of things beforehand. You had to go in a pure state. And then you had this all-night session where you were given a drink, which they think was a psychedelic potion. The scholars argue what was in it. It was some kind of magical potion that enhanced their perception. And then they watched a performance, like partly theater, partly music, partly dance, and things were shown that, and because they were in this state of heightened perception, they were shown the entranceway to the kingdom of heaven. And after this initiation, everyone that went through it knew for a fact about the immortality of the soul. Not just they read it in books, but they themselves existentially knew the soul survives death. Now, they were sworn to secrecy, so we don't know exactly what happened in this initiatory ritual. But every single Greek man and woman that wanted to know the truth, they did these mysteries. And most of the great intellectuals, people like Plato, underwent these mysteries. And it's, that was the living core of Greek religion, if you want. So we come to Plato, another great, he was an initiate of Eleusis, but he also studied Pythagoras's work. He went to southern Italy. He met people who'd known people that knew Pythagoras. He was looking desperately for Pythagoras's lost writings. He couldn't find them. He was an aristocrat descended from the god of the sea, Poseidon, who was the Greek equivalent of Manala. He wasn't a total pacifist. Plato argued in his Republic that you need a class of warriors. They should be well trained. You have to defend the country. I mean, Greece was attacked fiercely by the Persians and nearly wiped out. But thanks to the Greek military discipline, they defended Greece and miraculously stopped the biggest empire in the world at that time, which was running all the way from northern India to Greece. They wanted to capture Greece. But Plato and Socrates, his teacher, said, no, we will defend this. But the ideal city-state won't use its warriors much. And Plato, sort of a bit like the Druids and the Brahmins, he said there should be this class of intellectuals, what he called the philosopher kings. They should make the decisions and they should be in charge, but they themselves won't fight. They're like the Druids or the seers, these philosopher kings. And their duty is to educate people into illumination, like a Brahmin or something. So it's the same idea resurfacing. We've seen it in India and in the Celtic world. We see it in American Indian culture with Daganawida. Now we see it with the Greeks. So, and he founded the academy, which was the first beginning of that tradition we call the academic tradition. That was Plato's idea. If we could have a school where people were taught to see the vision of the good, as he called it, to see the light outside the cave, because most of us are just trapped in like normal reality in a cave. No, there's a place of intellectual vision beyond that. And once you've seen that, all thought of killing, violence fades away, because you see through the game of, killing and being killed. And you come to a place of love. Plato argued that eros, true platonic love, as he called it, is a much better force to engage with. And if you can fall in love with ideas, with the soul of somebody, then that's the path to immortality, much better than killing. And so I want to just carry on and finish this segment by mentioning the Romans, because these Greek ideas were very influential. They inspired Roman civilization as well, which came later. The Romans were much more a warrior race. Their city, Rome, was built by warriors. They worshipped Mars, the god of war. And they were pretty fearsome with their armies. They conquered a lot of the Mediterranean. They defeated the Phoenicians and Carthage. And they built the biggest empire the world had seen, the Roman Empire. Conquered Gaul. Caesar was a typical Roman warrior, pretty ruthless. He didn't have any time for non-violence. No. He killed, it's thought, 3 million Gauls during his conquest. And he was particularly interested to kill the Druids because they were the intelligentsia. But he himself eventually was killed, as we know, assassinated, because the Roman Republicans realized they had a bit of a monster. There was an undercurrent. Roman intellectuals were studying Greek philosophy. Cicero, who was the wisest Roman intellectual, he went to study philosophy in Athens. He met people that worked within the academy. He studied, this idea of epoche, which we'll come to next time when I talk about the Jains in more detail. This idea that you suspend judgment because reality is so complex. You can't just take one position. The academic mind is trained to look at all the possible positions and then work out rationally what is true. Cicero was writing about this, at that time. He also wrote about religious phenomena. He wrote a book called On the Gods, which is a very important view of Roman religion. And the fact is that the Roman state early on had certain kings before it became a republic. And the wisest of the Roman kings, everyone agreed, was a man called Numa Pompilius, who was a Sabine. That was a town not far from Rome. And they asked him to become king of Rome because they recognized he was wise. Numa said, I'll only do it if you agree to do what I say, right? Put that in writing. And they agreed. So Numa became the king of Rome, and he introduced religion to the Romans. Because up to that time, they were pretty barbaric and warlike. Their idea of fun was like, having a fight and getting the swords out and killing a few people. Numa stopped all that by introducing religion. He made every day some feast for a god. And his gods were the rivers, the trees, the lightning, Jupiter, the king of the gods, manifests as lightning, Juno, his wife, the queen of the gods, she turned up at childbirth, love affairs, Venus, the goddess of love, she came when you fell in love with somebody, and so on. And all these gods had their own temples. Numa insisted they all had their temples, their priests and priestesses. They should be worshipped, and they all had special feast days. So on a particular day, you went to the temple of Juno and worshipped marriage, because Juno was the patron of marriage. On other days, you go to the temple of Neptune and worship the sea and fertility of fish and all that. And so Numa's theory was, if we keep the Romans busy with religion, they won't have time for war. They'll be so pious. So, for instance, there were many different tree deities and prayers. You had to worship a tree before you could cut firewood down. You had to say a prayer if you were going to cut the whole tree, and they were different, So anyway, he was a genius. Now, he said, this has come down, people have written his life story. He was inspired by Carmenta, who was like a nymph, a goddess, a muse, who inspired him, because that female element wanted peace, right? And peace was a goddess to the Romans. There was also a temple to her, Pax, right? So Roman religion has always had this tension. And I think one of the reasons they became such strong Christians when they converted later, as we'll see, was they remembered Numa Pompilius saying religio is better than war. And it's still a struggle within the soul of Roman culture and European culture. We're good at war, but we kind of know it's not what we ought to be doing. There's something deeper, and that's worshipping the gods. So anyway, I'm going to stop there. Any questions or comments, feel free. We can have a discussion, but I've covered quite a lot of ground in this section.
I think you have given a very enlightening lecture on covering all the diverse religions. So it's actually a lot to take in at the first go. But yes, I learned a lot, and hopefully the audience would also learn a lot from this series. So would you like to recommend any introductory book to start with?
Well, I mean, I do want to give a plug to the periodic table of religions. This is the poster, that's one format. There's a bigger size, and there's a book that comes along with that. I'll be talking about this later in the course, but if there's one book that students should read, you should get the book that goes with this poster and the poster, because all the religions I've talked about today are covered in this table, plus loads of others, which we're going to look at later on in the course, right? Let me get, the right way up. So the primal religions are the green ones. We've looked at them. And the Buddhist ones we haven't looked at. They're the red ones. We're coming up to them. And each religion has its own color code. So the Chinese ones are these pink ones here. So Taoism, Confucianism, they're all there. In the book, it goes into much more detail about who founded them, when, what its sacred texts are, how many people follow it. So the code in the table tells you how many people follow that path now, but also how many people in the whole of history have followed that, the cumulative total. Those are the scientific elements of the table. And there's also the Shinto religion here, the Japanese, which I hope we'll have time to look at. So any reference materials you want, look up, get that book. It's called The Periodic Table of the World's Religious and Philosophical Traditions. And obviously I'm the author. It's available on the internet. You can buy it and have it shipped to your home. It's not expensive. And then get the poster, which is coming, and make sure it's put up in your school or university, the poster. So that's the first thing I'd say. In terms of the primal religions I talked about earlier on, I would recommend a book by Mircea Eliade, Eliade. It's called Shamanism. And Mircea Eliade was professor of religious studies at the University of Chicago. And he was the first real scholar of religious studies to look at shamanism, pagan religions, in huge detail. It's about 600 pages, amazing number of footnotes. I mean, the guy was a genius. So if you're interested in what I was talking about, shamans and the primal religions, look up Mircea Eliade's book. He also wrote, by the way, similar book called Yoga, and I'd recommend that as well. It's another great thick 700-page book. He spent time in the Himalayas studying with a rishi, a sage, and he learned the practice of yoga, as well as he studied all the scriptures, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the whole lot. So he was an amazing academic, and I suppose, yeah. So read Eliade. About American Indian religion. Well, there is a book called American Indian Religion, which I've used quite a lot in my own studies. It's a less developed field. Most departments of religious studies don't look at American Indian religion, but in America they do. I've been to the University of Oklahoma, which has a Center for American Indian Studies, and there are scholars beginning to realize this is a really interesting tradition. And it has its light and dark. It had its horrible human sacrifice stuff, and it had its enlightened sages, as do all cultures. The voice of women is very important in the North American Indian culture. The sages were often women, and there's one woman called Jamie Sams who's still teaching in the Americas. She produced a set of cards called something like the Spirit cards, I can't remember, which are like a deck of cards with a book that comes with it. If you want to learn about American Indian religion existentially and practicing, then look up Jamie Sams and her Spirit Oracle, or whatever it's called. She's got a website, and I hope to God she's not dead. She's getting on, but I hope COVID hasn't got her yet. She's a living sage, right? And the women keep alive the American Indian religion in their circles. For instance, one of the people who works with me on the Wisdom Keepers Council, she's a descendant of the Daganowida tradition in Canada, I think. And they're dealing a lot with people on the reservations who are alcoholics, who have problems. The American Indian culture was decimated by illness, and then by alcoholism. The whites found they could defeat their soul by giving them whiskey and making them drunk all the time and stealing their land. So what they're trying to do is fight back by recovering the wisdom of their own ancestors. And so she uses teachings from Daganowida with adolescents who are struggling with life, with alcohol and all the rest of it, and drugs. She teaches them how to use these gifts in the wise way, how to become a proper human being, to protect and defend your community with wisdom and not just falling apart. So, yeah, there are people doing that kind of work. There are good encyclopedias of religious studies people can get hold of. Penguin do a good encyclopedia of religions. It's a cheap paperback. If you haven't ever dipped into all what I've been talking about, then get a good encyclopedia paperback and get it on Amazon, for a few hundred rupees. It's definitely worth getting. And hopefully you'll realize this is a really important part of human life. We can't ignore this. If we're going to win for a world of non-killing, we have to activate the wisdom sages of all these traditions. That's kind of what I'm arguing.
Definitely. I think that's a great initiative. That's a tremendous initiative, rather, taken up by you. I hope we succeed in this endeavor. So,
Sure.
we shall be winding up here. The session, we'll conclude the session with the remark that each and every religion has its own beauty, and through this course, we are trying to bring out the best aspects of the religion and how they can help in promoting reverence to human life. That's it. Thank you.
Can I just say one last thing before we finish,
Yes,
Kacheni?
yes.
Because I wasn't sure whether to include it, but I did originally say I'd cover the Jain religion this session. If you look at the flyer, we were going to do the Jains. And I'd just like to take a few minutes just to add the Jains on to this as the ending. I think we've still got a bit of time. Because, you know, I began the talk by looking at Hinduism and talked about how non-violence was very important to it. I think where Jainism comes in is it was a development out of that idea, which Mahavira, who founded the Jain religion in its modern form, stressed ahimsa more than anyone else. You know, of all the sages that I've talked about in this session, his commitment to non-violence was absolute, even to the point of like wearing a mask and not swallowing an insect and all that kind of stuff. But he felt that he was a warrior from the Kshatriya class in northern India. But he felt that warriors should evolve as initiates. The greatest warrior is the one that conquers himself or herself. And that's what the word Jain means. It's a self-conquered, victorious person, right? And the Jains themselves, and I've been to India 10 times, I've met lots of Jain sages. I met Acharya Tulsi, who was a modern day Jain leader in Rajasthan, who'd met Gandhi and many of the leaders of India over the years. He taught the philosophy of ahimsa and founded a university in Ladman called the Jain University of Ladman, where they do an MA in peace studies and so on, and nonviolence. And they went into the philosophy of nonviolence in great detail. The Jains argued that to purify consciousness, you have to disengage from absolutism. The reason people do violence is they're absolutely convinced that A is better than B. And it can be anything, you know, a dress, a diet, a book, a text, a religion, a house, a culture, a language. A is better than B. What Acharya Tulsi taught me, and it was in the lineage from Mahavira, is if you disengage from A or B, you adopt the philosophy of Anikantavada, which means literally there are many infinite number of perspectives to any decision. So should I prefer A or B? Well, I can think of 100 reasons why A is best. I can also think of 100 reasons why B is best. So to quiet my mind down and not be tormented by this, I go to a place called Anikantavada of recognizing the relativity of plural views, right? And by cultivating a simple lifestyle of nonviolence, by nonviolence of thought, word, and deed, so I don't think violent thoughts, I don't act violently, and I don't speak violence, gradually my mind becomes quieter, my soul becomes purified. And the Jains believe that that's the path to enlightenment. If I can follow that path and go and hang around teachers that teach that equanimity or enlightenment, then I will in turn be able to spread that and share that. They're not all celibate. I mean, to be a monk or a nun, you have to be totally celibate. But the Jain lay people, they fall in love and get married and have families. But they always keep at the core of their relationships that detachment, that non-violence. And I've met many of them. They're very amazing people, I think. So, and they're important to India's culture because they inspired and influenced Gandhi. Gandhi's mother, although a Hindu, also sat at the feet of local Jains, and many of the sages of Indian philosophy have also learned from the Jains. They do believe in the soul. They, like the ancient Egyptians, they believe that when we die, we have to give account karmically for our actions. So if we've been very violent, cruel, mean, we have to pay for that karmically, somehow. But if we've been pure, if we've led a life of purity and ahimsa, we get eventually to go to this place called Siddhaloka, which is at the top of the universe. The Jains think the universe is like a kind of big cosmic tree. And this is a heaven world where all the enlightened sages eventually go. We wind up there after countless lives. So, the Jains have like a heaven world, and they believe that you survive after death, which is a bit simpler than the Buddhist idea. We'll look at the Buddhist idea, in a couple of sessions' time. But the Jains are closer to the Hindus in believing in the soul that survives death. Jainism believes that it is the original religion of India, actually, even before Hinduism. The earliest teachers, and they look back thousands of years to a whole sequence of what they call Tirthankaras, or ford crossers. What they mean by a Tirthankara is someone that can navigate across the stream of suffering through teaching and example. And then the latest one was Mahavira, but there've been others before him. And if you go to a Jain temple, you'll see statues of the others as well. My friend at the University of London is Peter Flugel, has written books on the Jains academically. There's no consensus as to, were there really Tirthankaras 100,000 years ago? Who knows? I began by talking about primal religion going back at least 100,000 years. Maybe the Jains have carried on an oral tradition of people and non-violence right from the beginning of the first humans in India. I don't know. Wouldn't that be lovely if it's true? So there is light. I just want to end with that. The Jains I know, they wear white, the women and the men, the monks, and we've worked deeply together on non-violence conferences in Jaipur, which take place every couple of years. And I think that's where we met, isn't it?
Yes.
At the Jain conference. Yeah, so we owe to them the magic of the beginning of this course, in fact. So anyway, thank you for letting me explain. The Jains are an important part of this story, and it's an ongoing quest for ahimsa, non-killing, in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, Thomas. And with this, I would like to end the session for today. So thank you all of you for patiently listening to our dialogue.
Sure. And next time we're going to talk about monotheism, which will be very interesting. Yeah, okay. Right, thank you, Dr. Singh, for all your work in organizing this. Thanks.
Thanks.